What if everything you believed to be sacred, every prayer whispered in reverence, every symbol carved into ancient stone, every ritual performed under starlight, was nothing more than the invention of a science fiction writer from the 1980s? In the autumn of 2087, humanity's first interstellar archaeological team stood inside what they called the Cathedral of Echoes. It was buried 3 kilometers beneath the frozen crust of Kepler 442b, a planet that orbited a dying star 42 light-years from Earth. The chamber was massive, carved from obsidian-like rock that seemed to drink the light from their scanning equipment. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in symbols. Not primitive scratches or pictographs, but elegant, flowing characters that formed complex grammatical structures. They curved and interlocked with mathematical precision, each glyph placed with the kind of deliberate care that spoke of centuries of cultural refinement. Dr. Sarah Chen, the team's lead linguist, had been trying to decode these symbols for 3 months. She had run every analysis algorithm in the xenolinguistics database. The syntax didn't match any known Earth language, living or dead. The phonetic markers suggested sounds that human vocal cords could barely reproduce. Carbon dating of the organic compounds mixed into the inscriptions placed them at roughly 8,000 years old, which meant this civilization had been writing complex texts while humans on Earth were just beginning to plant their first crops. The breakthrough came during a routine scan of what appeared to be a ceremonial altar. The symbols there were different from the wall inscriptions, more angular, more aggressive. Dr. Chen noticed repeating patterns that suggested a poetic or liturgical structure. She isolated a sequence that appeared frequently throughout the chamber and ran it through her translation matrix. The AI struggled, found no matches in its database of Earth languages, and was about to return an error when Dr. Chen made a decision that would change everything. She opened the cultural reference database, the one that contained not just real languages, but fictional ones created for entertainment. Books, films, television shows, video games. Every constructed language humanity had ever invented for storytelling purposes. The system pinged immediately. Match found. Confidence level 97.3%. Dr. Chen stared at her screen, convinced there had been an error. She ran the analysis again. Same result. She isolated different passages, fed them through separately. Every single one came back with the same impossible answer. The language carved into these ancient alien walls, the sacred texts of a civilization that had died millennia before humans had written their first word, was Klingon. Not similar to Klingon. Not inspired by Klingon. It was Klingon, specifically the dialect developed by Marc Okrand for Star Trek III, The Search for Spock in 1984. The implications hit her like a physical force. She pulled up the high-resolution scans and began matching specific phrases to her Star Trek language database. There was a passage near the altar that translated perfectly, "Today is a good day to die." Another section, clearly ceremonial based on its placement and repetition throughout the chamber. "Revenge is a dish best served cold." And there, near what appeared to be a depiction of their gods, beings of pure energy rendered in intricate detail across the curved ceiling, the phrase, "Perhaps today is a good day to die." Dr. Chen didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. She cross-referenced every inscription she'd photographed, every fragment they'd recovered from the dig site. It was all Klingon. Perfect, grammatically correct Klingon, used in contexts that made complete sense within the framework of what appeared to be a warrior culture that venerated honor and combat prowess. The aliens who had built this place, who had carved these prayers and battle hymns and creation myths into solid rock, had somehow been using a language created for a 1960s television show. The next morning, she brought her findings to Commander Marcus Webb, the mission director. He listened in silence as she presented her evidence, watched as she overlaid Klingon translations onto the alien text with perfect accuracy. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked the only question that mattered. How? The possibilities were limited, and all of them were disturbing. Either this was the most elaborate hoax in human history, which seemed impossible given the age of the artifacts and the fact that they were on a planet that hadn't been discovered until 2071, or something far stranger was happening. Maybe humans hadn't invented Klingon at all. Maybe Marc Okrand had somehow channeled or remembered or accessed something ancient and real when he'd created it. Maybe there were patterns in the universe, linguistic structures that emerged independently across galaxies, and humanity had stumbled into one of them by accident when creating entertainment for television audiences. Or maybe, and this was the theory that kept Dr. Chen awake during the long Kepler 442b nights, time wasn't as linear as everyone assumed. The discovery went public 6 weeks later. The scientific community erupted into factions overnight. Linguists argued that convergent evolution of language was possible, that mathematical constraints might naturally produce similar grammatical structures. Physicists began publishing papers about closed time-like curves and information flowing backward through space-time. Anthropologists suggested that human culture might have been influenced by contact with this civilization millennia ago, creating a subconscious memory that surfaced when Okrand designed his fictional language. The conspiracy theorists, for once, struggled to come up with theories more outlandish than what the mainstream scientists were proposing. Star Trek conventions became impromptu academic conferences. People who had spent decades learning Klingon as a hobby found themselves in demand as translators for genuine alien artifacts. The Klingon Language Institute, once considered a quirky fan organization, was suddenly receiving grant funding from NASA and the European Space Agency. Dr. Chen returned to Kepler 442b with a larger team and better equipment. They found more chambers, more inscriptions, more evidence that an entire civilization had risen and fallen using a language that shouldn't have existed. They found what appeared to be schools where children learned to write these characters. Libraries containing thousands of texts, poetry, history, scientific treatises that used Klingon technical terminology that Marc Okrand had invented for Star Trek VI to describe real physics and engineering principles. And then they found the ship. It was buried in a lava tube 5 kilometers from the Cathedral of Echoes, preserved in the airless cold for 8,000 years. The hull was intact. The markings on the side were clearly visible under their lights. Dr. Chen stood at the base of the massive vessel, aimed her translator at the inscription above what appeared to be the main airlock, and watched as the device rendered the ancient text into English. IKS Vengeance. May she fly with honor. But it was the discovery in the ship's command center that changed everything, that turned archaeological mystery into existential crisis. They found the captain's log, stored in a crystalline data matrix that their engineers managed to access after weeks of careful work. The entries were dated, not in the Gregorian calendar, obviously, but the time references were clear enough. The final entry, written in the hours before the ship crashed and the crew died on this frozen world, contained a passage that Dr. Chen translated with shaking hands. The words described their mission, their purpose for traveling so far from home, their desperate hope that someone, someday, would find what they'd built and preserved on this remote planet. And there, near the end, was something that made her blood turn to ice. A reference to the world they'd come from, the civilization that had sent them into the darkness carrying their language and culture and faith. They called it Earth. The crystalline data matrix sat on the examination table in the mobile laboratory, its facets catching the harsh LED lights and scattering them into rainbow fragments across the sterile walls. Dr. Chen had been staring at it for 40 minutes without moving, without blinking, barely breathing. Commander Webb stood beside her, equally motionless, as if they'd both been turned to stone by what they'd read in that final log entry, Earth. The word hung in the air between them like a phantom, impossible and undeniable. The alien crew, if they could even be called aliens now, had referenced their homeworld using the exact Klingon word that Marc Okrand had created to represent Earth in the Star Trek universe. Not a translation that happened to match. The actual word, with all its linguistic markers and cultural connotations intact. "Run it again," Webb finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chen didn't argue. She'd already run the translation sequence 17 times, hoping each time that the result would be different, that she'd made some fundamental error in her analysis. But the AI was certain. The linguistic matrix was clear. The contextual markers all aligned. These beings, 8,000 years ago, had launched from Earth, carrying a language that wouldn't be invented for another 7,900 years, crashed on Kepler 442b, and died there with their impossible secret carved into stone. She initiated the sequence again. The holographic display materialized above the data matrix, reconstructing the log entry in three-dimensional Klingon script that slowly rotated as it translated into English. "We are the last of the Comorex Klingon, the Klingon Empire that once spanned 12 systems. The plague has taken our worlds, our fleets, our families. We carry with us the sacred texts, the histories, the battle songs of our people. If we die here, let whoever finds us know that we lived with honor, that we chose death in the stars rather than extinction on dying worlds. We came from Earth, from the northern ice where our ancestors first rose to consciousness under alien skies, and we return to ice. Let the circle be closed." The same words, the same impossible claim. They came from Earth. Dr. Chen pulled up the biological analysis data from the crew remains they'd recovered from the ship. The bodies had been mummified by the cold and the thin atmosphere, preserved in death with their armor still intact, their weapons still clutched in rigid hands. The initial scans had shown humanoid physiology, bipedal, bilateral symmetry, similar skeletal structure to humans, but with significant differences. Reinforced cranial ridges, denser bone structure, redundant organ systems that suggested adaptation to harsh environments or combat trauma. But it was the genetic analysis that told the real story. She opened the file she'd been avoiding for the past 6 hours, the one that the biotech team had flagged with urgent priority markers and multiple requests for verification. The DNA sequencing results displayed across her screen in cascading helices of color-coded base pairs. The Klingon crew shared 94.7% genetic similarity with modern humans. That number sat in her mind like a stone. It was too high for parallel evolution, too high for coincidence. Humans shared 98.8% of their DNA with chimpanzees, their closest living relatives. These aliens, these Klingons, were genetically closer to humans than humans were to orangutans. The divergence markers suggested a common ancestor approximately 40,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic when Homo sapiens were spreading across Earth, painting cave walls and burying their dead with ceremony and care. "It's not possible," Webb said, reading over her shoulder. "Humans didn't have spaceflight 40,000 years ago. We barely had fire and stone tools." "No," Dr. Chen agreed. "Humans didn't. But what if something else did? What if there was another branch on the evolutionary tree, one that developed faster, reached for the stars while we were still learning to hunt mammoths?" She pulled up comparative anatomy files, overlaying Klingon skeletal structure with human frameworks. "Look at the cranial ridge formation. It's not decorative. It's structural, designed to protect the brain from impact trauma. The redundant organs, the enhanced musculature, these are adaptations for survival in extreme conditions. Maybe for space travel, maybe for war." She zoomed in on the skull of one of the recovered crew members, a warrior who had died at their post with their hand on what appeared to be a weapon control interface. The ridge formation was distinctive, pronounced, following a pattern that looked almost familiar. Dr. Chen pulled up her personal files, the collection of Star Trek reference materials she'd downloaded years ago when she'd first gotten interested in constructed languages. She found what she was looking for in a design document from the makeup department of Star Trek, the motion picture. The ridge pattern was identical, not similar. Identical down to the subtle variations that makeup artists had created to make each Klingon character look unique and individual. The warrior who had died 8,000 years ago on Kepler 442b had ridges that matched the template created by Fred Phillips in 1979 for a science fiction film. Dr. Chen felt reality sliding sideways. She steadied herself against the examination table, forcing her mind to process information that seemed designed to break logic itself. "We need to contact Earth," she said. "We need archaeologists, geneticists, historians. We need to start looking at our own past with new questions." The message took 42 years to reach Earth at light speed, but they sent it anyway, encoded with everything they'd discovered. And then they kept digging. They excavated the ship completely, documenting every detail, every scratch in the hull plating, every personal effect left behind by the crew. They found quarters that had belonged to families. Children had died on this ship, young ones who would never grow up to become warriors or scholars or whatever they might have chosen. There were toys, simple things carved from metal and stone. There were drawings scratched into the walls, the artistic expressions of young minds trying to make sense of death and distance and the dark between stars. Dr. Chen found a small pendant in one of the crew quarters, a piece of worked silver hanging from a chain. The symbol etched into its surface was the trefoil emblem of the Klingon Empire, the three-armed design that John Eves had created for Star Trek. The next generation. She held it in her gloved hand, this piece of jewelry that had been worn by someone real, someone who had lived and loved and died, believing in something that shouldn't exist. And she wept. The team established a permanent research station on Kepler 442b. More scientists arrived on the next transport ship, bringing equipment and questions and theories that competed and contradicted and occasionally aligned. They expanded their search radius and found more sites. An entire settlement, frozen in time, where hundreds had lived for decades before whatever catastrophe had ended them. Schools, temples, training grounds where warriors had practiced combat techniques that looked disturbingly similar to the choreography from Star Trek fight scenes. And then they found the archive. It was deeper than the Cathedral of Echoes, hidden behind layers of rock that had taken millennia to accumulate. The chamber was enormous, carved from the living stone of the planet itself, and every surface was covered in text. Not just Klingon script this time, but images as well. Star charts, historical records, technical diagrams that showed ships and weapons and devices that defied easy categorization. Dr. Chen stood in the center of the archive with her translation device and began to read. The history unfolded like a fever dream, like mythology made manifest in stone. The text described Earth 40,000 years ago, when two species of humans walked its surface. One branch, smaller, lighter, adaptable, would eventually become Homo sapiens. The other branch, stronger, more aggressive, adapted for conflict and survival in the harshest environments, would become something else. The text used a word that Dr. Chen's translator rendered as the warrior people, but the Klingon term was more specific. Tel Chingan, Klingons. According to the archive, the two groups coexisted for thousands of years, sometimes peacefully, often not. But the warrior people grew restless. They looked at the stars and felt a calling that their smaller cousins didn't share. They began to build, to experiment, to push the boundaries of what was possible. The archive showed primitive spacecraft, generation ships powered by nuclear fusion, vessels that could barely survive the journey between planets. They left Earth in waves, over centuries, spreading to nearby star systems with glacial slowness. Some colonies survived. Most didn't. Those that endured adapted, changed, became something harder and more resilient. They developed their culture around survival, around honor and combat prowess, because those were the traits that kept them alive in the darkness. They created their language, their writing system, their entire civilization in the space between worlds, isolated from Earth for so long that they became something new, something alien. And then came the plague. The archive was vague on details, but the outline was clear enough. A biological weapon, perhaps, or a natural pathogen that their immune systems couldn't handle. It swept through their scattered colonies with devastating speed. Worlds died. Fleets were abandoned. The Klingon Empire, if it could even be called that, a loose confederation of survivors clinging to the edge of extinction, made a final decision. They would send ships back toward Earth, back to the origin point, carrying with them everything they had built and learned and become. Some ships would seed their culture on viable worlds along the way, leaving evidence of their existence for whoever might follow. The IKS Vengeance had been one of those ships. They'd made it to Kepler 442b and gone no further. Dr. Chen read the final section of the archive 3 times before she allowed herself to believe what it said. The text described a hope, a prayer carved into stone by people who knew they were dying. They hoped that their cousins back on Earth, the smaller humans who had stayed behind, would eventually reach the stars. That someday, humans would find what the Klingons had left behind. That the 2 branches of humanity, separated by time and space and evolution itself, might somehow be reunited through the evidence of their shared past. And then came the passage that made everything else make terrible, wonderful sense. The archive described how the warrior people had known, on some level, that their story wasn't finished. That they would somehow persist, not in flesh and blood, but in memory and dream and story. That the humans who came after would carry the echo of their existence forward in ways they couldn't predict or understand. The text used a phrase that Dr. Chen's translator struggled with, but the closest English approximation came out as, "We will be remembered not as we were, but as we wished to be." She stepped back from the wall, her mind reeling. Marc Okrand hadn't invented Klingon. He'd remembered it. Somehow, through the tangled web of genetic memory or collective unconscious or whatever mechanism allowed information to leak backward through time, he'd accessed something real and ancient and true. Every Star Trek writer who had contributed to Klingon culture, every fan who had learned the language, every convention where people dressed in ridged foreheads and quoted battle poetry. They had all been participating in an act of remembrance, bringing back to life a civilization that had died alone in the dark. Dr. Chen thought about the pendant she'd found, the toys in the crew quarters, the final words in the captain's log. She thought about honor and courage, and the desperate hope that someone would remember. And she realized, with a clarity that felt like falling and flying at the same time, that the Klingons had gotten their wish. They had been remembered. Not as the desperate dying refugees they'd actually been, but as warriors of legend, as a proud empire spanning the stars, as exactly what they had wished they could be in their final moments. Humanity had dreamed them back into existence as myth and story, and now archaeology had made them real again. The global response to Dr. Chen's findings arrived on Kepler 442b in the form of 6 additional research vessels, 3 military cruisers, and 1 unmarked ship that refused to identify its crew or purpose. The planet that had been a footnote in astronomical surveys just 2 years earlier was now the most significant archaeological site in human history. And everyone wanted a piece of what it meant. Dr. Chen watched the ships descend through the thin atmosphere from the observation dome of the research station, each one trailing vapor contrails that froze and fell like snow in the low gravity. She felt a tightness in her chest that had been growing for weeks, a pressure that had nothing to do with the station's life support systems. They were here to take this away from her, to turn a profound mystery into a political asset, to weaponize the past in ways she couldn't yet imagine but could feel approaching like a storm front. Commander Webb joined her at the window, holding 2 bulbs of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "The lead diplomat wants to speak with you in an hour," he said quietly. "Something about cultural patrimony and historical claims. I think Earth governments are already arguing about who owns this." "Nobody owns it," Dr. Chen said. Though she knew how naive that sounded, it's bigger than ownership. It's about understanding who we are, where we came from. It's about... She stopped, searching for words adequate to the enormity of what they'd discovered. "It's about realizing we've been telling ourselves our own origin story for thousands of years without knowing it was true. But the diplomats and military officers and corporate representatives who flooded into the research station over the following days had different concerns. They wanted DNA samples, technical specifications from the crashed ship, access to the archive for their own translation teams. The Cathedral of Echoes was declared a secure site, and Dr. Chen needed written authorization to visit the place she'd discovered. She watched as the story she'd been carefully, reverently piecing together became data points in competing narratives, each group finding in the Klingon ruins whatever evidence they needed to support their predetermined conclusions. The Genetic Heritage Coalition claimed the Klingons as humanity's lost cousins and demanded that all recovered biological material be repatriated to Earth for proper burial. The Technology Reclamation Project wanted to reverse engineer the fusion drives and weapon systems, arguing that the Klingons' advanced technology was humanity's birthright. A group called the Temporal Integrity Foundation published papers claiming that the entire site was proof of a stable time loop, that Marc Okrand had been visited by time travelers or had accessed future memories through quantum entanglement, and that any attempt to change or analyze the ruins would create a paradox that could unravel causality itself. And then there were the Trekkies, thousands of them, demanding passage to Kepler 442b, insisting that they had a right to see the place where their beloved fictional universe had somehow become real. The Klingon Language Institute sent a delegation that included their most fluent speakers, people who could recite battle poetry and philosophical texts in perfect Klingon, people who had spent decades honoring a culture they'd believed was invented. Dr. Chen met with them in a small conference room, watched their faces as she showed them photographs of the archive, the ships, the toys left behind by children who had died speaking the language these fans had learned from television shows. One of them, an elderly woman named Margaret who had been teaching Klingon to college students for 30 years, began to cry. "I used to tell my students it was just for fun," she said, her voice breaking. "Just a hobby, just a way to exercise linguistic thinking. But I always felt like there was something more to it, something I couldn't explain. Like the language had a weight to it, a reality. And now..." She looked at the images on the display screen, the careful script carved into alien stone. "Now I know I wasn't crazy. I was remembering something we were all remembering." Dr. Chen understood that feeling. She'd been experiencing it constantly since reading the archive, a sensation of recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. Every Klingon phrase she translated felt familiar in a way that made her skin prickle. Every cultural practice described in the ruins, the emphasis on honor, the ritualized combat, the complex relationship with death and glory, resonated with something buried in human psychology. Not as alien concepts, but as exaggerated versions of traits that existed in humanity's own warrior cultures. The Spartans, the samurai, the Vikings, they had all touched on similar themes, similar values, similar stories. What if that wasn't coincidence? What if the genetic memory of the Klingons had been flowing through humanity all along, surfacing in myths and legends and cultural archetypes? What if Gene Roddenberry, when he'd created his alien warriors for Star Trek, had been unconsciously channeling the echo of humanity's lost cousins? And what if Marc Okrand, working alone in his study, creating a language for those warriors, had tapped into something far older and more real than anyone had imagined. The questions multiplied faster than answers, breeding in the spaces between certainty and doubt. Dr. Chen spent her nights in the archive now, sleeping in a corner on an inflatable pad, surrounded by walls that spoke in the voice of the dead. She was translating faster than ever, pushing through exhaustion with stimulants and determination, driven by the sense that time was running out. The diplomats and military officers were circling closer, preparing to classify information, to lock down the site, to turn profound mystery into strategic advantage. She found the next revelation 3 weeks after the diplomatic ships arrived, in a section of the archive she'd initially catalogued as ceremonial poetry. The text was dense, layered with metaphor and allusion, written in an archaic form of Klingon that suggested great age, even within the context of the already ancient ruins. Her translation AI struggled with it, offering multiple possible interpretations for nearly every phrase, until Dr. Chen began to see patterns in the ambiguity itself. This wasn't poetry. It was encoded information, deliberately obscured, written by someone who wanted the truth preserved, but hidden from casual observation. She worked through the night, cross-referencing symbols and grammatical constructions, building a decryption matrix from context clues scattered throughout the archive. As dawn broke over Kepler Form 42b's frozen horizon, painting the observation dome in shades of copper and ice, the text began to resolve into clarity. The Klingons hadn't just left Earth, they'd been exiled. The archive described a war, brief and brutal, fought 40,000 years ago between the two branches of humanity. Not over resources or territory, but over philosophy, over vision, over fundamentally incompatible ideas about what humanity should become. The warrior people wanted to reach for the stars immediately, to take risks, to embrace conflict as a tool for evolution. The smaller humans wanted to develop slowly, to build stable communities, to master their world before reaching beyond it. The war lasted 3 generations. The warrior people were stronger, fiercer, better adapted for combat. But they were outnumbered 10-1, and the smaller humans had something the warriors lacked: patience and cunning, and the ability to work together in ways that transcended individual glory. The final battle took place somewhere in what the text called the Cradle of Ice, a location Dr. Chen's geographical analysis suggested might be northern Europe or Siberia during the last glacial period. The warrior people lost, but instead of extermination, they were given a choice: integrate and abandon their culture, or leave Earth entirely and never return. They chose exile. They built their primitive ships and departed in waves, carrying with them everything they valued, determined to prove that their way of life could survive among the stars. The smaller humans watched them go, and then, in an act that the archive described with a Klingon word that meant something like strategic forgetting, deliberately erased all evidence of their existence. Dr. Chen leaned back against the cold stone wall, feeling the weight of 40,000 years pressing down on her chest. Humanity had committed genocide by exile, had forcibly removed an entire branch of its evolutionary tree, and then had systematically forgotten it ever happened. The cave paintings, the archaeological record, the genetic studies, all of it had been interpreted through the assumption that Homo sapiens was alone, that any other human species had simply died out through natural causes. Nobody had looked for evidence of a deliberate separation because nobody had imagined it was possible. But memories don't die easily. They sink into the substrate of consciousness, waiting. They surface in dreams and stories and the creative acts of artists who think they're inventing something new. The warrior people had been gone from Earth for 40 millennia. But their ghost had haunted human culture the entire time, showing up in every tale of honorable combat, every mythology of warrior gods, every story that celebrated courage and glory and death in battle. And then, in 1966, a television producer named Gene Roddenberry had created Star Trek and had needed alien antagonists for his human heroes. He'd invented the Klingons, pulling from his subconscious a vision of warriors who valued honor above all else, who lived for combat, who saw death in battle as the highest achievement. Over the following decades, writers and artists and designers had refined that vision, adding layers of culture and language and philosophy, unknowingly reconstructing the civilization that humanity had exiled and tried to forget. Marc Okrand had been the final piece, the linguistic savant who had somehow reached into the collective unconscious and pulled out not just the feel of Klingon culture, but its actual language, complete with grammar and syntax and vocabulary that matched, word for word, the script carved into these ancient walls. He hadn't invented anything. He'd been an archaeologist of memory, excavating truth from the burial ground of human consciousness. Dr. Chen thought about the pendant she'd found, the one with the trefoil emblem that John Eves had designed. She pulled it from her pocket now, where she'd been carrying it like a talisman, and examined it in the pale dawn light. The wear patterns suggested it had been held often, touched with the kind of repetitive motion that comes from anxiety or prayer or desperate hope. Someone had clutched this symbol while their world ended, while their ship fell from the sky, while everything they'd built and believed in crumbled to ash and ice. And then, 8,000 years later, a concept artist working on a science fiction show had drawn the exact same symbol, pixel by pixel, curve by curve, without ever seeing this pendant or knowing it existed. The probability of that happening by pure chance was effectively zero, which meant it wasn't chance. Which meant the information had traveled through time somehow, flowing backward through the quantum foam of causality or sideways through dimensions of consciousness that physics hadn't yet mapped, or through some mechanism so strange that human language didn't have words for it yet. Dr. Chen heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Commander Webb entering the archive, his face grim in the weak light. "They're ordering us to evacuate," he said. "The military is taking over the site. Something about national security implications and need-to-know classifications. We have 6 hours to pack our personal items and board the transport." She looked at the walls surrounding them, at thousands of hours of translation work, at truths that the rest of humanity needed to understand. "We can't leave," she said. "We haven't finished documenting everything. There are entire sections I haven't even started translating yet. There could be more revelations, more connections between—" "I know," Webb interrupted gently. "But we don't have a choice. The orders came from the highest levels. They're calling this the most significant security matter in human history. They think there's technology here that could change the balance of power between nations, maybe even between Earth and the off-world colonies." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "There's also concern about the psychological impact. If people learn that humanity deliberately exiled part of its own species, that we've been lying to ourselves about our history for 40,000 years. They have a right to know," Dr. Chen said, hearing the anger in her own voice. "This isn't about politics or power or maintaining comfortable fictions. This is about understanding who we are. This is about recognizing that we've been connected to something profound and true this whole time. That the stories we told ourselves about Klingons were actually stories we were telling about ourselves, about the part of humanity we tried to forget." Webb moved closer, lowering his voice. "Which is exactly why they want to control it. Imagine what happens when people realize that their favorite TV show was actually recovered memory of a real civilization. Imagine the religious implications, the philosophical questions, the complete recontextualization of human identity." He gestured at the carved walls around them. "This doesn't just change history. It changes everything we think we know about consciousness and memory and time itself. That kind of knowledge doesn't stay neutral. It becomes a weapon whether we want it to or not." Dr. Chen knew he was right, but the knowing didn't make it easier. She thought about Margaret, the elderly Klingon teacher who had cried in the conference room, who had spent 30 years unknowingly honoring the memory of real people who had lived and died, believing no one would remember them. She thought about every Star Trek fan who had ever learned to say Kapla or Heglumia Kakjajvam, who had dressed in ridged foreheads and armor, who had gathered at conventions to celebrate a culture they'd thought was fictional. They were all participants in an act of resurrection, bringing the warrior people back from extinction through the power of story and symbol and collective imagination. And now the governments of Earth wanted to lock that story away, to classify the truth, to turn wonder into secrecy. She made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "I need to copy everything," she told Webb. "Every translation, every photograph, every piece of data we've collected, before they lock us out." "That would be illegal," he said carefully. "Violation of about 15 different security protocols. They'd charge you with everything from theft of classified information to treason." "I know." Webb studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll create a distraction. Something in the ship's power systems that needs immediate attention. Should give you maybe an hour before anyone notices what you're doing." He turned to leave, then paused at the entrance to the archive. "For what it's worth, I think you're right. This is too important to bury, even if it scares us. Especially if it scares us." Retry. Dr. Chen worked in silence, her fingers moving across her terminal with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows they're racing against time itself. The archive's translation files, the genetic analyses, the photographic surveys of every carved wall and recovered artifact. All of it flowed into encrypted storage modules small enough to hide in the lining of her jacket. Webb's manufactured emergency klaxons echoed through the research station's corridors, giving her crisis the cover she needed. She thought about the penalty for what she was doing, the years in detention facilities or worse, and found that the fear felt distant, abstract, less real than the words carved into the stone around her. When the data transfer completed, she sat for a moment in the archive's cold silence, surrounded by the voices of the dead. She placed her palm flat against the wall, feeling the grooves where ancient hands had carved their truth into permanence. "I won't let them forget you again," she whispered to the empty air. "Not this time." The military detained her before she reached the transport ship. They were professional about it, almost apologetic, but the restraints they placed on her wrists were real enough. Commander Webb wasn't detained. His emergency had been too convincing, too well-timed to seem connected to her actions. But she saw the knowledge in his eyes as they led her past him. He gave her the smallest nod, a gesture that meant either goodbye or good luck, or perhaps both. They held her in a small room on one of the military cruisers for 3 days, while officers questioned her about what she'd taken and where she'd hidden it. Dr. Chen said nothing. She'd prepared for this, had studied the legal protocols, knew exactly how long they could hold her without formal charges. On the 4th day, they released her to civilian custody and placed her on a transport back to Earth, her career in ruins, her reputation shattered, her freedom contingent on agreements she refused to sign. But Dr. Chen had spent years studying languages and codes and the ways information hides itself in plain sight. The data modules she'd encrypted and hidden in her jacket lining were decoys, sophisticated enough to occupy the military's attention, but ultimately meaningless. The real archive, the complete translation of the Klingon ruins, the proof of humanity's forgotten history, she'd uploaded to a distributed network before she'd ever left the archive chamber, scattered across thousands of civilian satellites and server nodes using compression algorithms she'd learned from studying the Klingon data matrices themselves. She'd set it to release on a timer, 6 months after her return to Earth, while Dr. Chen was teaching introductory linguistics at a small university under an assumed name. The archive went live. It flooded the internet all at once, appearing simultaneously on academic networks, social media platforms, file-sharing services, and streaming sites. Every translation, every photograph, every piece of evidence that connected Star Trek's Klingon language to the ruins on Kepler 442b. The data was too widespread, too distributed to suppress. Within hours, millions of people were reading the words of the warrior people, seeing the chambers where they'd worshipped and died, understanding that something impossible had been true all along. The response was everything Dr. Chen had hoped for, and everything she'd feared. Governments issued denials and then confirmations, and then began the slow process of admitting they'd lost control of the narrative. Religious leaders debated what it meant that fictional aliens were real ancestors. Scientists raced to replicate the findings, to confirm or deny, to understand the mechanism by which memory could flow backward through time. The Klingon Language Institute's membership grew by a factor of 1,000 in a single week. Star Trek conventions became pilgrimage sites where people gathered to celebrate not fiction, but recovered history. And everywhere, people who had spent years or decades learning Klingon suddenly found themselves connected to something larger than entertainment. They were the keepers of an ancestral tongue, the preservers of a culture that their own species had tried to erase. Every phrase they'd memorized, every song they'd learned, every ritual combat they'd performed in costume and makeup, all of it had been an act of remembrance, unconscious and profound, keeping the warrior people alive in the only way that mattered. Dr. Chen watched it unfold from her small apartment near the university, monitoring the discussions and debates and occasional angry protests from people who couldn't accept that their reality had been so fundamentally rewritten. She gave no interviews, made no public statements, let the evidence speak for itself. The governments that had tried to silence her eventually stopped looking, realizing that prosecuting her would only draw more attention to what she'd revealed. She lived quietly, taught her classes, and sometimes in the evenings would pull out the pendant she'd kept from Kepler 442b, the one piece of physical evidence she'd managed to smuggle past security in a way even she didn't fully understand. 3 years after the revelation, she received a message through encrypted channels from someone claiming to be Marc Okrand. The real Marc Okrand had passed away decades earlier, but his consciousness had been preserved in one of the early neural upload experiments, his memories and personality existing now as patterns of light in quantum processors. He wanted to meet her, the message said. He needed to understand what he'd done, what he'd been part of without knowing. They met in a virtual space designed to look like the archive on Kepler 442b, a digital reconstruction built from the photographs Dr. Chen had released. Okrand's avatar looked like him at 40, in his prime, the age he'd been when he'd created the Klingon language for Star Trek III. He stood in the center of the chamber, turning slowly to read the words on the walls, his face showing an expression Dr. Chen couldn't quite name, wonder mixed with sorrow, mixed with something that might have been vindication. "I always knew," he said finally, his voice carrying the slight distortion of synthesized speech. "Not consciously, but whenever I worked on Klingon, whenever I added new vocabulary or refined the grammar, I felt like I was discovering rather than inventing, like I was uncovering something that already existed and had just been waiting for me to find it." He looked at Dr. Chen. "Do you think I was remembering? Actually accessing genetic memory from 40,000 years ago?" "I think memory is stranger than we imagine," Dr. Chen replied. "I think time might be less linear than it appears. I think there are connections between minds and moments that physics hasn't mapped yet." She paused, considering her words carefully. "But I also think it doesn't matter how it happened. What matters is that you gave them their voice back. You helped resurrect a civilization that your own ancestors had tried to erase. That's not something most people get to do in a lifetime, even a digitally extended one." Okrand was quiet for a long moment, reading the Klingon script on the walls, The language he'd created or remembered, rendered in stone by hands that had been dust for 8 millennia. They hoped someone would remember them, he said. That's what it says here, isn't it? In their final words. They hoped that even if they died, even if their empire fell and their worlds went cold, that somehow their story would persist. And it did, Dr. Chen said. It persisted in the strangest way possible. Not through archaeological evidence or historical records, but through story. Through the collective imagination of millions of people who thought they were just enjoying science fiction. They kept the Klingon culture alive, refined it, expanded it, made it richer and deeper than it might have been in reality. In a way, the Klingons became more real in fiction than they ever were in life. She thought about all the fans who had learned the language, who had studied the honor code, who had debated the finer points of Klingon philosophy at conventions and online forums. They had taken Gene Roddenberry's vision and Marc Okrand's linguistic framework and built an entire civilization, complete with holidays and customs and artistic traditions. And now it turned out they'd been recreating something that had actually existed, filling in the gaps of history with imagination that was somehow also memory. The virtual reconstruction of Kepler 442b faded around them, replaced by a view of Earth as seen from orbit, the blue and white marble hanging in perfect darkness. What do you think this means for us? Okrand asked. For humanity, I mean. Now that we know we exiled part of ourselves to the stars. Dr. Chen considered the question, watching clouds swirl across the face of the planet where 2 branches of humanity had once fought a war over competing visions of the future. I think it means we're more complicated than we like to believe. We're capable of great cruelty. We drove our own cousins from their home. But we're also capable of unconscious redemption. We brought them back through story and memory, kept them alive in our myths, and eventually in our entertainment, until the moment when we could finally acknowledge what we'd done and try to make it right. Can we make it right? Okrand asked. They're dead. They've been dead for thousands of years. What does redemption even look like when the people you wronged are extinct? Maybe redemption looks like remembering, Dr. Chen said, like refusing to let them be forgotten again, like honoring what they were, not what we wanted them to be, like acknowledging that they were part of us, that they still are part of us, that every time someone quotes Klingon poetry or studies their language or tries to understand their culture, they're connecting with a part of humanity's story that we need to remember. She turned to face his avatar directly. You helped make that possible. You gave them words, and words are how we make meaning out of chaos. Words are how we tell ourselves who we are. The digital Okrand smiled, a strange expression on a face that wasn't quite real. I spent my whole life working with language, studying how meaning gets encoded and transmitted across minds. But I never imagined that meaning could travel through time like this. That information could flow from the past to the present through dreams and intuition and creative inspiration. He gestured at the earth floating in the void below them. It changes everything, doesn't it? If consciousness can access information that exists outside normal causality, if the past can speak to the present through channels we don't understand, what else might be trying to communicate with us? What other lost stories might be waiting in our collective unconscious, ready to surface when we're finally ready to hear them? Dr. Chen thought about all the myths and legends and archetypal stories that appeared across cultures, the recurring themes that anthropologists called universal patterns of human experience. What if some of them were memories too? What if the stories of gods and heroes and great floods and lost civilizations were fragments of actual history, preserved in narrative form because consciousness had no other way to keep them alive? What if every story humans told was also, in some sense, a story humans were remembering? Maybe that's what art is, she said softly. Maybe creativity is just advanced archaeology. We think we're inventing new worlds, but we're actually excavating old ones, digging through layers of consciousness to find truths that existed before we were born. She thought about Gene Roddenberry, envisioning his optimistic future, about John Eves designing Klingon emblems, about every writer and artist who had contributed to Star Trek's elaborate mythology. They were all archaeologists, even if they didn't know it. They were all bringing something real back from the darkness. The virtual space began to fade, their allotted time running out. Before Okrand's avatar disappeared completely, he spoke one final sentence, and Dr. Chen felt the words settle into her bones like truth carved in stone. Heglume kak jajvam. Today is a good day to die. The most famous Klingon phrase, spoken by warriors facing their end with courage and acceptance. But Dr. Chen heard it differently now. She heard it as the voice of people who had known they were dying, who had carved their culture into frozen rock on a distant planet, who had hoped against hope that someone would find them and remember them and understand that they had lived with honor, even in exile. They had died 8,000 years ago, alone on a world of ice, believing they had failed, but they hadn't failed. They had persisted in the only way that mattered, through story, through language, through the immortality of meaning that transcends flesh and bone. They had become legend, had achieved a kind of life after death that no religion had ever promised. They had been remembered not as desperate refugees, but as glorious warriors, not as victims of genocide, but as proud defenders of honor and courage. Fiction had redeemed them in ways reality never could. Dr. Chen stood alone in her small apartment, holding the pendant with its impossible symbol, and wondered what else humanity had forgotten. What other parts of itself had been buried or exiled or deliberately erased. What other ghosts were waiting in the collective unconscious, trying to speak through the dreams of artists and writers and creators who thought they were just making things up. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Somewhere in that city, in cities all across Earth, and in colonies scattered through the solar system, people were learning Klingon. They were studying the archive, reading the translations, connecting with ancestors they hadn't known existed. They were participating in a resurrection, bringing the warrior people back from extinction through the simple act of remembering. And maybe that was the answer to the question Dr. Chen had been carrying since that first day in the Cathedral of Echoes, when she'd realized that an alien language was somehow identical to a fictional one created for television. Maybe it didn't matter how the information had traveled through time, whether through genetic memory or quantum entanglement or some mechanism beyond human understanding. What mattered was that it had traveled. What mattered was that the dead had spoken, and the living had listened, and the story had continued. Memory, Dr. Chen realized, might be humanity's superpower. The ability to carry the past forward, to resurrect what was lost, to refuse to let meaning die even when everything physical turns to dust. The Klingons had hoped someone would remember them. They had gotten their wish in the strangest way possible, through a television show and a constructed language, and millions of fans who had thought they were just having fun. But fun was never just fun. Entertainment was never just entertainment. Every story humans told was also a story humans were remembering, reaching back through time to connect with truths that predated conscious knowledge. The Klingons had known this somehow. They had carved their hope into stone and trusted that consciousness would find a way to preserve what matter could not. Dr. Chen closed her hand around the pendant and whispered into the empty room, "Kapla." Success, victory, the traditional Klingon farewell, spoken now not to fictional aliens, but to real ancestors, to the warrior people who had reached for the stars and found only cold darkness and distant death. They had asked to be remembered. Humanity had remembered. And in that act of remembrance, separated by 8,000 years and 42 light years and the impossible distance between fiction and truth, the two branches of humanity had finally been reunited. The question that had driven Dr. Chen through months of translation and analysis and eventual exile from everything she'd worked for now had an answer. The lost language had been worshipped as divine code, had been treated as sacred and profound and mysteriously significant. And then a human had said, "Wait, that's just Klingon." And everything had changed. But the change hadn't diminished the sacred, it had expanded it, had revealed that the sacred and the constructed and the remembered were all the same thing. All threads in a tapestry of meaning that connected past and present and future in ways that transcended simple causality. Perhaps that was the real lesson carved into the walls of Kepler 442b. Not that aliens were real, or that time could flow backward, or that consciousness had strange powers, but that meaning itself was immortal. That stories once told never truly die. That every act of imagination was also an act of archaeology, excavating truths from the dark soil of collective memory. That humanity's greatest power was not its technology or intelligence, but its stubborn refusal to let anything be forgotten, its determination to preserve meaning even when all else turns to ash and ice and empty darkness between stars. Retry.